Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
You know, one of the attacks that we can hear as Christians against Christianity is, oh, you know, the Gospels, they've been altered. Well, what would you say to somebody who says, haven't the Gospels been altered, Jim?
Yeah, and that was one of my first doubts. Number one, it could not have been written early, because all these fictional accounts of miracles and stuff like that, they couldn't have been written when people were actually around to say no. Yeah. And the other question was, well, maybe these accounts, the supernatural aspects were inserted later. Maybe the first version of Jesus was a simple guy who was a good teacher, but not a miracle worker, didn't walk on water, and didn't rise from the dead, for crying out loud. So it's got to be a late insertion. Well, one thing we do in criminal cases to determine if the stuff we see at the crime scene is actually the same evidence we have in the courtroom, even though 30 years can separate these two events, is I look at what's called the chain of custody. And it simply is this. Do I have a photograph or a report description of that piece of evidence, let's say it's a shell casing, at the scene of the crime? Did an officer take a Polaroid back in the day? Or did he write it in his report, describing it very accurately? And then he gives it to the person at property who takes a report and signs it in. I see he signs it out. And they sign it to another detective at some point who takes another Polaroid and describes it again in his report, and he brings it to the crime lab. They take a 35mm photograph back in those days, and then they would sign that back out to another detective who also takes another picture or describes it again and brings it into the courtroom 30 years later. Well, now I can see a snapshot of this casing from the crime scene over and over and over again all the way to the courtroom. So I can look and see, well, you know, that little nick I see and that little scrape mark, that was on the original. I know that's been there for 30 years. Same kind of thing can happen, I think, with the Gospels. We have an original, supposedly piece of evidence, say it's the Gospel of John. But how do we know that John's Gospel hasn't changed dramatically? Well, he had another officer in the chain of custody that he gave that Gospel to. He taught that Gospel to 3 students, Papias, Ignatius, and Polycarp. And they, as church leaders, wrote a letter to their followers in which they describe what they learned from John. And they give it to another officer in the chain of custody, their student Irenaeus, who gives it to his student Hippolytus. All these folks wrote about what they learned over the years, and we can then see if the version of Jesus we have, let's say at the first council that affirms the canon in Laodicea in 363, what does that Jesus look like compared to this Jesus? And as we look at it, Jesus never changed. The Jesus that we know today, who claimed to be God, who born of a virgin, rose from the dead, that Jesus is present at every stage in the chain of custody.
See, that's so assuring, isn't it?
It is, because you can see that it hasn't changed over time.